Thank you for joining the information session for our National and International Environment Program. As I said earlier, I'm the program officer at the Trust and handles all things environmental. We have 2 letter of interest windows that open up 2 times a year for our National and International Environment Program. It's unusual. New York Community Trust is one of the oldest and largest community foundations in the United States. And we are, like all community foundations, quintessentially a place-based funder. However, because of the generosity of a donor in the mid-90s, we were able to, she left us with a good chunk of change to do grant making on environmental issues of national and international significance for perpetuity. We use a 2-step process for that, which I will get into a little bit later. So my responsibilities at the Trust are threefold. I run our NYC Environment Program, which is made up of several funds that focus on lots of different issues, from renewable energy to open space to protection of New York City's air, land, and water. I also manage a fund focused on Central Appalachia, which the Trust has been using to support a just transition away from dependence on fossil fuels, particularly coal, in that region. And finally, the majority of the grant making I'm responsible for at the Trust is through our National and International Environment Program. The reason I wanted to sort of cover those 2 other program areas is because there are often instances where I recommend to our board a blending of these funds. And for those organizations that might be considering, for example, a proposal that focuses statewide or on the New York metropolitan area, including New Jersey and Connecticut or what have you, understanding the dynamics between these program areas are important. If a budget or an initiative focuses more than 50% on the 5 boroughs, that should go through our national and international environment program, rather than through this 2-step process, or I'm sorry, through our NYC Environment Program, which is an open application process, rather than through our National and International Environment Program. If more than 50% focuses outside of the 5 boroughs, then it actually goes through this process that we're going to be describing today. Similarly, if a proposal or initiative that you are thinking of has a focus on Central Appalachia, we would take that into consideration and see whether there might be opportunities or instances where we would blend our national money with a little bit of the Alexander Fund, which funds our Appalachia work. So essentially, since 2014, the board approved a new strategy for our National International Environment Program. That strategy is on our website. If you haven't done so, you should definitely go to our website, take a look at our guidelines, and also download that strategy, which I was one of the architects of it. And I'm happy to say that it has proven to be the kind of flexible framework that we had hoped for, because it has proven to be useful even during seismic shifts like occurred with Trump, with the Trump administration and the Trump administration's hostile approach, essentially, to environmental issues generally and clean energy issues generally. So go ahead and download that strategy and take a look at it carefully as you focus on your LOI, whatever it might be. You'll see in that strategy that we have like 4 strategic priorities described there: climate mitigation and clean energy, climate resilience and adaptation, environmental health, and biodiversity conservation, particularly focusing on conservation corridors and different measures that connect fragmented habitat. So a couple other kind of pointers, broad pointers for your LOI is that, generally speaking, LOIs and initiatives that focus on multiple jurisdictions tend to be more competitive. We also focus particularly on systemic change, so LOIs that identify some sort of barrier or some sort of systemic problem and make a credible case for how the initiative is going to help overcome or address that problem. Those tend to be more competitive. And if you have a proposal that focuses outside of New York State and it only focuses on one state, it really definitely needs to focus on something that's of national significance. If there is a fight going on, that the implications of it, how it pans out, really has national or even international significance, it's possible that such a proposal could potentially be deemed competitive, but it is less likely. So as I intimated earlier, in addition to the open application process that I manage for the New York City Environment Program, I managed this one. Since 2016, we have adopted a two-step process. The trust, we open 2 submission windows every year, one in the February-March timeframe, another in the September-October timeframe. And we basically moved to that 2-step process because we were only probably about 15% or so of the full proposals we were receiving resulted in a recommendation to the board. And I just felt that it wasn't good to impose upon all of those organizations across the country to do full proposals for that kind of success rate. So the powers that be, the senior management here at the trust, agreed to go with this new that's not new now, but this 2-step process, which is a much more manageable, basically essentially 4 pages, 3 pages of narrative, and 1 page of a preliminary budget. So so we last fall is the first time that we started doing these information sessions. And I should say, for those people who were participating in the last information session we did, a lot of this stuff is refresher and remedial, and that's fine. It's just going to be reminding you of stuff that you learned last time, or if you've been successfully submitting to us for a while, it's just reinforcing some of these things. But hopefully some of the little pointers and some of the things I mentioned will still be useful to you. And if you have specific questions about something that you're thinking about, that's also useful in the information session. So one thing that people that are advantaged by joining this information session can learn is that we actually accept, I will review up to 2 letters of interest per organization. On very rare occasions, we get 3 letters of interest from one organization. In those cases, I will reach out to them and let them know that I will only be able to review 2, and then give them the option of which one to withdraw. But generally speaking, I can and do review up to 2. The process for LOIs is once the LOI, the submission window closes, that creates the pool of LOIs that I will be reviewing and comparing against each other. You should immediately start receiving emails in that first week or so for those proposals that we have not deemed competitive and that we're not going to be going towards the next step. And then the vast majority of them, however, that have some interesting ideas or some interesting potential investments for the trust, I will be undertaking some additional research and analysis around them, looking at things like the policy landscape, looking into organizations that I might not be familiar with, that kind of thing. And then in the end, during that process, we will invite a small number of full proposals. So once again, it's competitive. So if passes prologue, only about 15 to 18% of LOIs will result in an invitation to submit a full proposal. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the proposal or the initiative was not worthwhile. In fact, that's one of my biggest struggles as a program officer. There's just so many worthy ones out there that I wish I had 3 times as much money to work with as I do. So one of the kind of insights from that is that even if you don't succeed the first time around, you should continue to potentially submit LOIs in the future, and even LOIs on that particular idea, particularly if you didn't get what counts as an early decline. That means it was in the pool that requires additional research. You should think about submitting again in the future. And there are several instances where if at first you don't succeed, try again, actually resulted in success of getting a grant from us. So this is a very common request, either before when we open the LOI submission window, or even as after there's an invitation to submit a full proposal. I have people reaching out and asking if they can basically work with me to develop a proposal. That is really not our process. It's impossible for me to do that. And because it's impossible for me to do that with everybody, I don't really do it with anybody. We really try to be very transparent. I think you'd find for a national environmental funder, we are amongst the most transparent in the scene, both in terms of our processes, in terms of our strategy, our guidelines, et cetera. So what kind of stuff do I look for in this pool of LOIs? One thing that you should be aware of is that you should try to avoid submitting LOIs that are too duplicative of something that we are currently funding or that we have recently funded. On our website, you'll find a place that has all of our press releases. Every board meeting, we have 5 board meetings a year. Those boards meet the first Thursday of February, April, June, October, and December. And when the board meets and approves the docket of grants, we will release, do a press release that has a short description of what the board has approved. I really encourage grant seekers to look at those LOIs, or look at those press releases rather, for the past 3 years or so, just to make sure that what you're submitting isn't too duplicative for something that we've already funded, are funding, or recently funded, because it's just not something that would probably be terribly competitive. That's not to say that there might not be possibilities where something you're submitting is truly complementary or synergistic, but not sort of duplicative or too overlapping. The other sort of big thing that I look at with the pool of LOIs harkens back to our focus on systemic change. We look at things like, this is what's involved with policy landscape analysis that I do, is like what are happening right now? Are there leadership changes? Is this proposal really has a credible chance of making a difference in producing lasting systemic change? And I also really look at the proposals, both the LOIs and the proposals afterwards, communicating a really sophisticated understanding of the policy landscape, because that more than anything gives me a little bit of a window into the capacity of the organization submitting. And quite frankly, one of the things I love about this job is that I learn so much, and I learn continuously, and the LOIs and the proposals are one of the key ways that I learn about the various policy fields that the trust is supporting. And finally, just to beat a dead horse here, I do like to, before I even read the LOI pool or read through the LOI pool, is to sort of revisit the strategy, read through the strategy once, just to refresh my memory and keep that firmly in mind. So I'm going to talk a little quickly about the budget in the LOIs, and both the LOIs and the proposal, because there are several times that these budgets can be confusing to folks, and that and then can create a weakness that makes a difference. So even for the preliminary budgets, we want them to include an expense section and a revenue section. The expense section should include things like personnel, that's a combination of staff time and fringe, and program costs or other than personnel services, which can be a combination of any number of things: meetings, travel, communications, direct action, consulting, contracted services, all of those things that fall into the program's costs bucket. And then finally, and this is an important thing, the trust is one of the major funders of the nonprofit sector in New York City. For organizations that, particularly organizations that maintain a brick and mortar building or office, we think that including administrative overhead of a certain percentage is just good practice. So anywhere from between 10 and 20%, we're not really going to bat an eye at an administrative overhead line that is in that range. And for more virtual organizations, it can be less than that. And finally, for very, very large institutions like universities or hospitals, we have put a cap of administrative overhead on 5% because they have a really, really high indirect costs from all the work with the federal government over the decades. And finally, the thing that, in the revenue section of the proposal, the thing to be really cognizant of is looking at secured funding versus likely funding. And this is how I view those things. Secured funding can be anything like a holdover from a last grant, carryover from a last grant. It can be something where the board has approved a grant, but you don't have the money yet. It can be something where you have a commitment and you're just waiting for the money to come in. All of that counts as secured funding as far as we're concerned. Likely falls in the category of where you have a situation, let's say I invite a full proposal, we have a proposal review, and I tell you, okay, I'm comfortable going to bat for this with our board. If you've got a situation similar to that, where you have a program officer that has told you that they're going to bat for the proposal, you can put that into the likely category, and I may look at that favorably, or will look at that favorably when I look at the financials, because 95% of the time, program officers are successful when they go to bat for something to their board. And finally, New York Community Trust is a public charity. So we can have up to $1 million that we can support in lobbying every year. And this is very, very different than private foundations who are precluded from supporting lobbying. So I like to bring this up in these sorts of sessions, because you should think, particularly if you're doing an advocacy grant, whether lobbying makes sense to include in the LOI or in the proposal or in the full proposal. And in those instances, all you need to do is specify a top line for the lobbying, and then break that top line down into grassroots and direct lobbying in your budget. So here's an example of a budget. This is sort of pretty basic one. You look at the personnel lines. It's really, really important to subtotal things, because it's one of the pet peeves of most program officers, not to subtotal things where things are not subtotaled. And then you can see those examples of program costs, but that's very, very small example, and then administrative costs, and then you see the projected likely income and secured income there. All right, so grant periods. This is a big thing. Like, what grant period should you do? The vast majority of our grants are for grant periods of 12 to 18 months. The 18-month time period doesn't necessarily mean that you can ask for greater amounts of money. Typically speaking, a single organization can get anywhere from 100 to 150,000, depending on the nature of the project. Partnerships and coalitions can get above that, between 150 and 200,000. But the 12 to 18-month grant period, the 18-month grant period can be a very intentional strategy when, for example, there is lobbying involved in a project. And if there's you want to get a couple of legislative sessions as part of your effort into your work, then having an 18-month grant period makes a lot of sense. And there's other instances as well where that longer grant period can work. Now, we also do occasionally 2-year grants and very occasionally 3-year grants. You have to, in those instances, the budget should have columns for the first year, columns for the second year, and a combined budget for both years. And you should also have a revenue section. We understand that the revenue projections for the second year are going to be more speculative. That's fine. You just tell us as much as you can about the second year and the first year. And the other thing to think about also with your LOIs and with the projects or initiatives you're asking us to support is that we tend to think about things in arcs of grants. About 70% or so or more probably of our of the support you get, or an organization, 70% of the organizations that we support are going to get more than one grant out of us. So we look at things as like 2 and 3 and 4 grant arcs. It's not 4 years because, you know, the grant periods can be different, but we look at things that way, and we often look at the policy landscape and what's trying to be achieved during that time period as we evaluate things. But always remember to emphasize within the proposal what outcomes, what outputs, what impacts you're really confident that you're going to be able to do in that grant period, even if you have a longer time horizon for your ultimate goal as expressed in the proposal or the initiative. I already sort of mentioned the importance of reviewing our past grant making. I also touched on sort of the windows of opportunity issue. This is really particularly important right now in New York City, for example. We have a brand new mayor, we have a new comptroller, we have 2/3 of the city council is new, we have a governor in her first year here in New York State, and we have a federal administration at the beginning of its second year. So these are examples of windows of opportunity, but there could be other types. Any kind of leadership change that you think creates a window of opportunity and will perhaps allow for some traction or induce some momentum is worth sort of touching upon in your proposal. And one common thing I can see in proposals is referencing model programs or demonstration projects or pilot programs. And I can tell you the environment, every policy landscape, but the environmental policy landscape in particular is littered with pilot programs and demonstration projects that have withered on the vine. And part of the reason I think that is that whatever decision maker that demonstration project is trying to demonstrate something to is often not involved in the design of the demonstration project or the pilot program. So if you include that kind of element in your proposal, really try to signal that you are working very closely with whoever that decision maker is or that you're trying to influence with that program. And finally, don't be afraid of your numbers. Well, don't be afraid of certain numbers don't add up. You can make this an aspirational budget. Please make sure the other numbers add up. But like you can be aspirational in your project budget. And this is not a grant budget. This is the project budget. I should have mentioned that earlier. One other common mistake is that people are coming asking us for 100,000 and their preliminary budget in the LOI is a grant budget, which is what they're going to use that 100,000 for. That's not what we're interested in seeing. We're interested in seeing a project budget that allows you, for example, to leverage other sources of funding, hence the revenue section. So you can be aspirational in your budget, and it's more of an art than a science because you don't want to be so aspirational that we think, well, there's no chance they're going to make this budget. But it's also good to signal that you are understanding that, or that your project initiative to be maximally impactful might need to have a larger budget. So that's it. That's my spiel. I'm going to stop sharing now so we can go immediately into Q&A, and I really encourage you guys to weigh in, because whatever you ask is probably going to be of interest and useful to somebody else on the call. And as much as possible, as people who can, when they ask a question, come off of activate your screen so we can see your lovely faces during this time period. That'd be great.
We do have a question, Arturo, in the chat.
Okay.
When calculating the budget, what if our secured funding sources cover several projects, including the project we are requesting funding from at the trust?
Yeah, so I think that question, if I understand it correctly, may be conflating an organizational budget and a project budget. A project budget would be a subset of that. It sounds like they're talking about an organizational budget. You should, whatever the project budget is, whatever the initiative is, and you can craft a project that includes other elements of other projects in it, as long as it's a coherent project. And that's a very common sort of secret sauce that some people do in order to leverage other funding in the revenue budget. So if I'm understanding that question correctly, it should be a project budget and not an organizational budget. And Melanie, could you tell us who it is that's asking the question, by the way? And go ahead when we call on you, because we have Kristen, I see, has her hand up. Tadros, could you, I'm sure I mangled your last name, but Kristen, could people, when they ask the question, could you just identify, say your name and the organization you're with? So Kristen, go ahead.
You said my last name correctly, so great. My name is Kristen. I'm from Resilient Cities Catalyst, and I had a question about the national grant. Okay. So it says, like, in the, I believe in like the guidelines, that it, with the exception of like grants in New York State, that any grants outside of that must fund, like the projects must be in more than one US state. Do they have to be connected states? Like, I just want to know a little bit more about that.
No. And actually we've relaxed that quite a bit. Thank you for asking that question, because that's so important. We still find that the proposals that are most competitive are ones that focus on multiple jurisdictions. It can be cities and states and counties. Those tend to be, and they don't have to be in the same region. So those tend to be more competitive. But if there is something happening in a state, for example, in New York State at the moment, we have this thing called the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which is kind of a one of the nation-leading legislative frameworks for climate change. And you know, there's a very strong, vibrant coalition focusing on its implementation right now, and it has national implications to it. If you can make a case that something happened in a city or a state, Kristen, that like really has strong national implications, you may be able to be successful with a proposal that only focuses on that one place. But I tell you that that's going to be a heavy lift, because if I have got a really compelling proposal that focuses on 6 states or 6 cities, it's going to be tough if it's only one. Other questions? I see people that I haven't seen in a long time. Hey, Rolf, nice to see you.
We have a question from Taylor Thomas. Is there criteria for the characteristics of organizations you fund? Nonprofits, 501c3 status, etc.
Yeah, we actually can fund both C3s and C4s through the, well, just generally through our competitive grants program. We are able to fund C3s and C4s. For a while, we were not able to, we had to suspend our funding for C4s because of a state reg around disclosure that was inconsistent with what we are allowed to do with our donors. But that has sort of faded, thankfully. So yes, we fund both C3s, C4s. We funded C6s before, trade associations, or trade associations that are in coalition and partnership. And we've funded fiscally sponsored programs. So it's like we're pretty broad. in the types of things that we can fund through the national program. I will say, going back to my comment about partnerships and coalitions, we do have a mechanism where if a coalition or a partnership comes into us, we will actually directly fund the coalition or the partnership, and one of the entities acts as the funds administrator, the fiscal agent, and one acts as the primary project liaison. That's also a very common situation through our national program.
Okay, and then Lonnie Furbank had a question. Can you share a sample timeline for a successful LOI submitted during this upcoming window? So when would a proposal be due, and when would funding be distributed?
Yeah, that's kind of an iffy question, because we generally speaking, the LOIs, the proposals will be due in May, and those proposals will be competitive for, or will be in play for, our October and December boards. However, it is possible that an LOI comes in on an issue that is quite time sensitive, and I find it compelling, so that when the request for a full proposal comes to them, I will follow up and say, actually, we're considering this for our June board, so we need you to submit it in 2 weeks' time. So that happens on occasion. But so generally, the proposals that come in are in play for 3 or 4 board meetings. So the ones that come in May and June will be in play essentially for October, December, and February of 2023, those board meetings. And but it brings up a very good question. Could you also, when you ask a question in chat, just identify the organization so that Melanie can mention that as well? If there's a time sensitivity, like the window of opportunity issue that I raised, if there's a really strong time sensitivity in the proposal, that means that if it's not successful by, or if the funding doesn't come in by a certain month or something, you should highlight that, because that will take that into consideration. Other questions, comments, observations? And we have someone really joining really late, but Kai Young has got his hand up and he's applauding, so that's good.
Yeah, hi, Kai with the Foundation for Climate Restoration. The applause was accidental, but you deserve it anyway.
I appreciate it. Like, I was in theater in my 20s. I appreciate that.
Great, great. So my question is whether events can be included as a line item activity for a broader proposal, meaning sponsorship perhaps of a forum convening that we're doing.
Oh yeah, that's a very common, it's a good question. It's a very common thing to have events. Now, I would be cautious about asking for the trust for more than a certain percentage of the grant from us. Another very common format for proposals is that you have got the project budget, and then you also have the column that actually signals to us how you want to use our grant. It's very common. We don't require that format, but I find that format to be useful. If you are wanting to use like 50% of the trust support for one event, that's probably not going to be viewed on very favorably. But it's very common to have workshops and conferences and other things. And indeed, another thing that I advise people when they're doing an advocacy grant, if there are big events that you plan to participate in that are relevant to your project or initiative, you should mention those in the LOI that you're planning on sort of presenting, or already have an organizing role for this particular event that's relevant to the proposal.
Great. If I may quickly, one follow-up question. Our organization is really focused on carbon removal. So it's not mitigation, it's not adaptation, but it's sort of removal and dealing with legacy carbon. Eligible or?
Yeah, I
Okay.
am actually one of the voices in philanthropy, even though I get a lot of heat for it. I'm one of the voices in philanthropy who believes that unfortunately fossil fuel interests have done a very good job of delaying effective climate action for the last 2 generations since the Earth Summit. And we are in a everything but the kitchen sink, no stone left unturned, all hands on deck moment. Now, that doesn't mean that we should do things that are destructive or that actually, for example, there's some carbon capture and sequestration proposals that would expand the fossil fuel industry or give a lifeline to the fossil fuel industry. I think those are completely unacceptable. Similarly, ones that would expand factory farming. Factory farming, we should be moving away from for a whole range of environmental reasons. So anything that expands factory farming also doesn't make any sense to me.
Right.
But yeah, carbon removal definitely is, I think, going to have to be part of the mix. And I think the 116 of the 127 modeling scenarios they did for the Paris Agreement included some amount of carbon removal in the mix. And the pandemic has only, I think, probably made it more likely that it's going to be one of those 116 scenarios that we are embark on over the next 20 years.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Exactly right. Now I would hit the applause button for that response. Thank you.
You put it at the beginning. See, you inspired me. There you go.
Thank you, though.
Okay, Summer.
Yeah, you can just call me Summer. I know my first name is kind of long. I'm calling in from the Cancer Free Economy Network. And I saw on your program website that the National Environment Program funds protection of public health from the hazards of toxic chemicals and pollutants. And we specifically work on protection of the public health from a cancer standpoint. So looking at chemicals and pollutants that increase cancer risk. But I didn't know if that was something you would include in your definition of public health, specifically looking at chemicals from a cancer risk perspective and trying to eliminate that risk.
Yeah, first of all, let me say that we tend to, in our environmental health program right now, we have a strong focus on lead, and we have been one of the key funders on toxic chemicals, endocrine disrupting chemicals, different types of toxic chemicals over the years. And we're going to continue to fund in that area, although perhaps at a smaller level. The interaction with cancer risk is a little bit more complicated for us. We had a board member who was one of the nation's leading breast cancer specialists. So, you know, she sometimes was unconvinced of some of the science and was focusing a lot. There's just so much cumulative risk and cumulative impact involved. So the short answer is yes, that would be eligible. But you know, we would really have to ultimately look at what is being proposed and the science behind it to determine whether it would make sense for the trust to support.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you so much.
Okay, we have a few in the chat. This is from Christy Cooper with Youth vs. Gov. Is there any type of work that you do not fund, such as government, administration, outreach, or NVDA?
What was the last thing?
NVDA.
Non-violent direct action.
Oh, thank you, Christy. Yeah, no, we fund all of that. We do not. The only thing that we really don't fund is electioneering. So if you're supporting a particular candidate, that's not something that we're going to fund. We fund litigation, lobbying, direct action, all different types of stuff.
Okay, and then Jen Cool from Global Climate Action Network had a question. I noticed the word international a few times in the slide deck, but it sounds like most of the work you fund is focused nationally, but potentially with international impacts. Is that an accurate understanding?
Thank you for that question. It is not a completely accurate understanding. Um, we we do fund internationally focused work. It has to be a US-based organization. But we are, as I said earlier, community foundations are quintessentially place-based funders, and we have this unusual circumstance where we have this national and international program. So we dip our toe in the water internationally. We generally like to have one active grant in each of our strategic priorities focused internationally at any given time. And unlike the national program, usually I'm more involved with the developing or working with an organization that wants to do an internationally focused grant. So if you have an internationally focused grant, go ahead and submit an LOI, because it may lead to me having a conversation with you about something in the future. But it is much more. I'm sorry, I just have to be careful because my mom might be calling me. Okay, sorry, not my mom. Yeah, it's a very small number, like 3 or 4 at any given time, and you're probably going to not get an invitation to submit a full proposal, but you might get a call from me. It's like, oh, this was interesting. Let's talk about this for 2023 or 2024 or something like that.
Cool, thank you very much.
Other questions? These have been great questions, by the way. Thank you. So do we have any other questions in chat, Melanie?
No, nothing in the chat.
Okay, well, I am gonna give you guys this last moment, like before I like an auctioneer, going once, going twice, sold, for giving you 15 minutes back in your day. Oh, Kristen, you have another question?
I do, thank you. I was just wondering, I know you talked about it a little bit, but like, I guess, how much does it help if like the LOI, like if there's demonstrated, I guess, line item in the budget or even in the LOI that like the money is also going to other organizations, like community-based organizations?
Well, if you're coming in as a coalition project, it depends really, honestly. If you're coming in as a coalition project or a partnership project, then you should, the budget should sort of parse out like how much is going to each organization, blah, blah, blah. If, however, your organization is taking the lead of this coalition and you're submitting it as a single organization, but you're going to be engaging with a bunch of other groups that are part of the coalition, you should include line items, as you say, Kristen, as to like what goes, how much is going to those other organizations. This isn't a project budget, not necessarily in what you're asking from us, because it's important for me to see those resources, how those resources are being channeled to your partners. But I think it's more of a function of a weakness rather than their strength. An organization that talks a lot about working with others and being in coalition and partnership, and is not, particularly with smaller organizations, community-based organizations and what have you, and doesn't in the project budget have funding flowing to those sorts of organizations, I look at that as a real weakness in the proposal.
Thank you.
Well, any other questions? And I hope that many of you, I see LOIs from many of you after the window closed on 19th. Just reminding you that the window will close on March 18th and it will close at 11:59 Eastern Standard Time. That's important because you're not going to be able to submit after that time. If, however, something happens, which it can happen, and you don't meet that deadline, that doesn't mean I'm such a hard ass that I'm not going to like accept your LOI. Just go ahead and contact me separately, and we'll have a little bit of a grace period where I will submit the LOI separately into the system. So with no further questions, I want to thank you for your time and attention today. And I want to wish every one of you success in all your good works, because I know all of you are part of the solution rather than part of the problem. All right, take care, guys. Thanks.
Thanks so much.